Hey, what's up? It's Canucks This Week. Dan Riccio and Randip Janda. The dream is finally over, Randip. The Canucks officially eliminated from playoff contention. And the question is, where do the Canucks go from here?
Well, I have a message for Vancouver. Don't cry because it's over. Smile because it happened. At least you
Oh,
got
please.
that final stretch. All jokes aside,
But
yes,
at least you got Bruce. There it is. Jeez.
exactly. The chance, the high point for guys like Will Lockwood had a moment, but Juho Lammikko had that great moment. No,
What
okay.
what Will Lockwood moment was there? He had
He,
0 points in
he was
13 games.
he was running around trying to take people's heads off. All right, there was that moment. There was abrasion. No, for real though. All comedy aside, it's another year of Vancouver not making the playoffs, and yeah, I think for a lot of Vancouver Canucks fans, it's getting old and it's gotten old. But the reality is, this year was different because of Bruce Boudreau. And if you look at that second half of the season, if you look at from December on, this team did show something. Now the question here, Dan, is how much of it was real?
That is the big question. I think that's the biggest question for Patrick Allvin and Jim Rutherford as they go into this offseason. Because when they took over, especially Jim Rutherford, I don't think he really saw a team that had a ton of potential. He saw a team that was a work in progress with some young players. And I still do think that first assessment is probably correct. 105-point pace, that is great under Bruce Boudreau. And it would have gotten them in the playoffs were they playing that way for the full 82 games. But at the end of it all, even if, I had the Canucks as a playoff team coming into the season, but I expected them to be maybe in the mid 90-point range should they get there if everything broke their way. And they kind of end up just short of that, Randy, right? As bad as the first bit of the season was with Travis Green, they ended up where a lot of people expected them to. Vegas had them at 88.5 for their over under point total. So they're just above that. This is exactly who this team is. Now, there's some context there because we thought they would be poor defensively, better offensively, and the opposite was true because Thatcher Demko led this team to the best 5-on-5 save percentage in the NHL, and that has them as a top 5 team defensively at 5-on-5, bottom 5 in goals against, but they couldn't score at all this season. And I think that is the biggest thing that this team has to figure out and diagnose in the offseason. Where did our offense go at even strength from guys like Elias Pettersson? Brock Boeser has the same total points per 60 as Louis Eriksson did this year. I mean, these are not numbers you want to really look at because they are so damning. And that, for me, is the biggest thing they have to figure out.
Well, those individual players are one thing. And I have to say, I'm not right about a lot of things on this channel, as you can tell from my previous videos. But one thing I did say at the beginning of the year, Dan, was low 90s. And that's kind of where they're at in terms of point total. So I'll pat myself on the back on that one.
Yep.
It's the only thing I got right. Do not mention my predictions for the Calgary Flames. I will not hear about them. But moving forward, though, all right, this team, you talked about the star players and Brock Boeser and some of those players. I look at what is real with this team. And to me, what do you essentially, what's the direction of this organization? If you want to be a one-off playoff team, the squad that they have, the style that they played with Boudreau, may be possible if they kept up that pace. But to me, you don't bring in Jim Rutherford and Patrick Allvin and talk about culture change and hope for a fringe playoff team. No, you need to have depth. You need to build towards a team that is, in down the road, a team that can win you rounds, can turn yourself into a contender. So even though this, for a one-off, the pace was great, look at this team and look at this roster. It needs a lot of surgery. You talk about depth, really good teams, contenders, year after year, have that next man up policy. The Vancouver Canucks tried, and there's some valiant efforts on this team, but do they have the depth in the forward group and on defense to roll with the best teams in the Western Conference? No, they do not. Look at that right side of defense. And props to Luke Schenn. I love him as a player. I think he's one of the best teammates across the league. And he's upped his skill as, he's worked with Adam Oates. And you had a chat with Adam Oates on the radio show on Sportsnet 650 recently as well. He's upskilled. But the fact is, he is still on a good team, probably a number 6 defenseman, number 5 or 6 defenseman. You need to upgrade that right-hand side. What do you do to move some of those players around? What do you do to add forward depth, get younger, and have that next man up policy? So as impressive as that 105-point pace is, the question should be, Do the Vancouver Canucks have a long-term potential to be a contender? And I look at this roster, even with Bruce Boudreau as the coach, and I say, no, this was a one-off. You need to build towards being a long-term contender. One-offs aren't going to work, especially if you want to build a core around a Quinn Hughes, Elias Pettersson, and Thatcher Demko to actually do something in the playoffs. So we're talking about getting into the playoffs. But how do you do something in the playoffs year after year? That should be the goal in Vancouver.
Yeah, ultimately, you can't build a Stanley Cup contender when goaltending is the main reason you have success. And that's not to put down the seasons that Quinn Hughes or JT Miller have had, but like how often do you just see a team running on goaltending and playing at the top of the league? Yeah, you'll have one every year, but are they going deep in the playoffs? The reason the Tampa Bay Lightning are so good, their team is amazing and their goalie is amazing. That's why they're so difficult to beat, and they're back-to-back Stanley Cup champions. But the New York Rangers, are they going to be deep into the playoffs this year, riding Igor Shesterkin? Maybe you win a round, but I can't see them really going toe-to-toe with some of those beasts in the East. You can't build a team based on your goaltender. And we've heard Alvin and Rutherford, when they're asked about the identity of this team, they're like, well, we've got a good goaltender, and I think that speaks volumes to how they feel about it. And now you really have to take that into context, because as good as Demko is, and we expect him to be a top goalie in the league for a few years, can you bank on being the top five, or, being the best team at 5-on-5 save percentage every single year? No, you can't. And you shouldn't bet on that. That means they have to get better in front of Thatcher Demko. It's the most obvious thing with this team after this run under Bruce Boudreau. And on top of that, you look at their record under Boudreau, still not as many points as the LA Kings, who they were trying to catch for that third spot in the Pacific Division. 2 points better, only 2 points better than the Dallas Stars, 3 points better than the Edmonton Oilers in the time that Bruce Boudreau was with the Vancouver Canucks. So as good as it feels, that run, and yes, by points percentage, a little bit better than that, but it still just wasn't miles better than those other opponents, and that's what they needed to be. Now, as far as the roster goes, Randip, what is the most pressing question with what this new front office does with the roster?
The most pressing question is concerning when JT Miller. He has been their best skater this year alongside Quinn Hughes. But when you talk about a near 100-point player, this is going to be the most pressing question. What happens with JT? Does he stay in Vancouver? Most recently, in his even post-game availability, he's been talking about next year and playing in Vancouver and wanting to be in Vancouver, but it's not his decision. Does Jim Rutherford, Patrick Allvin feel as though he is best on this team, or is he best moved out and brought in? A number of assets are brought in exchange for him, and that's really going to be the question here. And it goes back to that word of direction. What is this team's direction? Do they feel like they've seen enough from this leadership group, from this forward group, to say, wait a second, JT Miller, 100-point player, we can couple that with what Elias Pettersson did in the second half of the year, and maybe we've got a shot at playoffs next year as well? Or do you say, still not good enough? To me, JT Miller is going to be the huge question, because that UFA status is looming, and you do not want to take a very risky decision here and say, hey, let's start the season with him. You have to ponder, is he best on your team? Is there a chance of an extension? And if there isn't, you have to pick up the phone. You have to start taking calls, because I can guarantee you one thing: there will be a lot of teams interested. And if you're looking for a hockey trade, if you're looking for a player for player type of trade, they might be possible this summer, depending on how many other players are available. So JT Miller with a bullet is the most pressing question for the Vancouver Canucks this offseason.
Yeah, he is unrestricted free agent at the end of next year, as is Bo Horvat. The Canucks have to re-sign Brock Boeser this summer. It's a lot of dough that they're going to have to be shelling out for a team that's already kind of capped out, and for a front office that has talked about creating a cap cushion so they can have some flexibility. How are you able to do that? How are you able to sign all of these players and maintain or gain some level of flexibility against the cap? And the answer is you just can't. I maybe you don't want it to come down to Horvat or Miller and which one you are going to keep, but that's probably what this question comes down to. And if JT Miller is set on the comp that we've heard from Elliot Friedman and others of Mika Zibanejad, $8.5 million per, I'm sorry, you've got to look at making a move there. And I don't think You're right. It doesn't make any sense to go into next year with JT Miller and a contract extension looming over that player, going into a deadline where maybe you're in the playoff race again and you've got to make that decision. Do you want to be Nashville with Philip Forsberg? Do you want to end up in the same situation that you did a number of years ago with Dan Hamhuis and countless other pending unrestricted free agents that the Canucks ended up letting walk for free? They've got no prospects. They've got nobody in the AHL outside of Jack Rathbone that really represents hope. So if you're going to build depth around Pettersson, Hughes, and Demko, you've got to find a way to upgrade the lower levels of your organization, to find some cheaper players, to find more value players. And reality is you're not getting value on signing JT Miller to a contract extension. He's been unbelievable this year, but I just don't know how much you can expect him to be around 100 points once he hits the age of 30 and into his mid 30s, giving him a long-term deal. Plus you have to ask that question very much the same with Bo Horvat. And you already have Oliver Ekman-Larsson on an albatross of a deal. There's just too much wasted dough on this roster that they have to figure out. Can they move a Tyler Myers? I think they can this offseason. Can they move Tanner Pearson if they really look for the opportunity? I think they can do that. But it's just really hard to imagine the Canucks maintaining all of this core. This offseason, one of this core has to move. If it's JT Miller, if it's Brock Boeser, I don't know which one it ends up being, but one of them has to go.
JT Miller is the most pressing question because of that UFA status, but Brock Boeser is the one. If you're looking at play, that is the most concerning one. You are asking questions of, okay, is this individual, can this guy cut it in being a top line player for this team? Can he provide consistency? Is he worth the money that he's going to end up making, whether it's in Vancouver or elsewhere? Listen, he's an RFA this year. He's going to get paid. His qualifying offer is 7.5. Does he sign something long-term? Does he take that qualifying offer? We'll wait and see. But to me, this is a concern of, is he worth that money? And that's a legit concern right now. I think a couple of years ago, you could have said, hey, Brock Boeser trending in the right direction. This guy's going to be a 40-goal scorer. You look at his stats this year, they've been underwhelming, as you mentioned early on. So even though JT Miller is the most pressing concern, Brock Boeser is the most concerning player at this point in time because you don't know what you're going to get with him. Even when he plays with Elias Pettersson, sometimes he's great. Other times, he's MIA. You barely notice him on the ice. That is the most concerning player to me because I'd be wary of signing him to a long-term extension right now based on the fact that you don't get consistency. And if we're talking trades, I know JT Miller is going to get a lot of headlines. Brock Boeser is the guy I'm looking at to say, all right, what else is out there on the market that you can maybe bring back? Because I can't rely on that player's consistency right now.
He's a poor man's Alexei Kovalev. When Brock's going, he looks great, but when he's not, he's kind of invincible. Final thing, and maybe the most important thing, Bruce, there it is. It's been the chant going around Vancouver, even last night as they get knocked out of the playoffs and they're beating up on the Seattle Kraken. Rogers Arena is ringing out, Bruce, there it is. But there's a big question there with Bruce Boudreau. The Canucks have an option to pick him up for next year, but he also has an option to say, you know what? I think there's grass is greener elsewhere if I want to look out on the market. Reality is, and the way things are trending right now, looks like there's going to be a negotiation to keep Bruce Boudreau as the head coach of the Vancouver Canucks. And it's hard to debate that would be the wrong decision, Randip.
No, he's done an amazing job. His messaging in the city, in the locker room, clearly has made an impact. Just getting the job done and winning is the priority. And that hunger, the Canucks players have that now. Earlier on this year, the first 25 games of the season, they didn't have that. So the Bruce Boudreau effect has been immediate and it's been constant. Now the question is direction, right? This is going to be the key buzzword in Vancouver was what is the direction? Bruce Boudreau is obviously one of the most successful coaches in regular season history in the NHL. We know that. But the Vancouver Canucks have not been that for the last number of years. And if you're looking to reload, if you're trying to bring in more younger players, you're potentially moving somebody off your roster, maybe a JT Miller, maybe a Brock Boeser, is that direction still, hey, we're going to try to get into the playoffs? I think with Quinn Hughes, Pettersson, and Thatcher Demko, you will always be competitive. You're going to be in a situation that you're fighting for the playoffs. But when it comes to Bruce Boudreau, I think Bruce would probably want to take a step up and say, yeah, let's be more of a threat next year. How does he feel based on some of the decisions that could be coming? And that's why I think even though the case for Bruce Boudreau to come back is a very strong one, what kind of team would he be coming back to? So If you're talking about thumbs up for bringing Bruce Boudreau back, absolutely, done a great job. But once again, the ball is back in the court of Patrick Allvin and co to say, what is the direction of this team? Because if they're potentially taking a step back next year, does that sound like a situation Bruce Boudreau enjoys?
Well, that's going to be a big problem because the PR disaster is waiting. If Bruce Boudreau is not the head coach of the Vancouver Canucks to start next year, people would be like, "What? This guy was like the best coach we've ever had. How could you possibly do that?" Maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but that's what it feels like with how much they've loved Boudreau. His honesty, he's affable in his post-game news conferences. You know, we all know those things about Boudreau, but he holds all the cards here now. Randip, he's regained reputation around the league. Teams like Vegas, Philly, maybe the Leafs have another first round exit and they're like, you know what? Let's bring in Bruce Boudreau. I think there's going to be other teams that are interested. No, I don't think. I know there are going to be other teams interested in Bruce Boudreau, which makes this negotiation very difficult for the Vancouver Canucks. Maybe one that's a little bit more expensive than they would have expected at the start of all this. Where do you think the Canucks go from here? Should they run back much of this core, give it one more chance at a playoff run? Or do they make some changes? And do you want to see Bruce Boudreau back behind the bench for the Vancouver Canucks? Let us know in the comments. We'll respond to as many as we can, and we'll see you in the next video.